Hi, and welcome to Random Walks HR with me, Tim Mathers, and today we are continuing my journey to try and figure out what was I talking about when I wrote my paper, Great Expectations, Reimagining People Analytics in a Wicked World. Today we're answering the question, what do you mean by a wicked world? Well, pretty simple really. The concept of kind and wicked environments is basically how we understand how machines or robots or algorithms adapt and learn to understand how to do human tasks, human behaviour, right? So essentially, if you want to know if your job's going to be automated or certain tasks can be automated or augmented by technology, you have to ask yourself three questions. One, is it a repeatable process or does it have clear rules, right? Is there a clearly defined process and will that continue into the future, right? Does what we do today is going to continue to happen into the future, in which case we can extrapolate forward. The second one, which is super important for algorithms and robots, is essentially, are there clear outcomes? Can we say if this is good, if this is bad, or is it ambiguous in terms of, actually we did this thing, we're not quite sure. Is there a quick feedback loop and say you did this, yes, that's good, or actually do we have to wait a long time to kind of get that feedback and understand whether it worked? If it takes a long time, it's not clear immediately whether it worked or not, that is where we have a wicked environment where machines and robots and so on may struggle to understand how to learn what we do. The last thing, especially around people analytics, is there a lot of historical data? Are these individual actions that happen every now and again when there's not a lot of data to really learn from, or actually do we have lots of data, as has happened a lot in the past, in which case it'll be easier to predict and use some of those fancy machine learning algorithms to understand what is the best way to do to going forward. So that's one concept. I'm going to marry it with another one because actually not all of our work is just basically a kind of wicked environment. A lot of the other time we're trying to work out whether we are exploring or exploiting, right? This was a little more intuitive. If you're exploiting, it's usually, you know what we're doing, we've got a sort of very good process, we've got a competitive advantage, and actually what we're trying to do is optimize. We're often trying to reduce costs, we're trying to deliver the same product but at a lower cost or quicker, so we're exploiting, we're trying to drive efficiency out of the engine. Exploring is kind of more value add, it's trying to generate more revenue, whether it's kind of thinking about different products, it's about figuring out how we market things, we're trying to generate value, and we're doing a kind of creative process to understand what maybe is the art of the possible to solve that problem, right? So explore versus exploit, and once we understand these two things, what we can start to really map out is exactly how we should approach different problems, whether they are kind of wicked or whether they are explore and exploit. And if you don't understand that, then hopefully you'll understand a 2x2, because everyone loves a 2x2, right? And here we have explore and exploit, and we have kind and wicked environments. So we're going to start at the bottom left and kind of go around clockwise, and we're just talking about techniques. How do we tackle these problems, right? So at the bottom left we have exploit in a kind environment, right? This is where we're very confident about, we know what we're doing, and we have a process that's going to continue. And I think this is where a lot of the people analytics came from, right? We do these things like call center optimization, right? We've got a lot of phone calls, we tend to know if they're good or they're bad, and actually we're going to keep on having phone calls into the future, right? And then we try and drill down, we try and maximize, we try and optimize. We can use some very smart, kind of algorithms, or we can use Erlang distribution to figure out how many people do we need in the call center at any one time. So, queues don't go beyond 6 minutes. Okay, you can start doing some very technical things. You can be very accurate with that analysis because you're very confident that A, you're in a kind of environment, and you're actually doing something that you are exploiting and trying to get more efficient at. And these are things that we can really automate, and these are things where bots and so on can come in really useful, both in terms of answering the calls, dealing with messages, but also how we forecast workforce needs. Now, if we stay with a kind environment, we can still be data driven. We can still kind of say, hey, the data says this, we think we should do that. If you're in explore mode, right, this is where economic modelling kind of comes in very useful, right, because we have a kind environment, like for example, I think of an example here, gender diversity representation, right? Lots of companies have targets. It's a kind environment. We have lots of females, we have lots of males, we've had them for a while. We're going to do the same processes, we're going to recruit, we're going to offboard, we're going to promote, and also it's not ambiguous, right? If a female leaves, that's bad. If a female joins, that's good. In the context of this, very much this model that's focused on this one thing, right? Once we do those things, suddenly all those data science tools, those economic models, those statistical tools become very useful, right? We can do predictive modelling. We can also understand, what are the drivers. We can start doing these fancy things. Same as psychometrics, right? If we know what we're trying to measure, we can look at the measurement tools and we can maximise and we can do dimensionality reduction, all these kind of things to understand what's happening. We can be very data driven in terms of, this is the thing, this is that, and this is what we have to do. And again, we can start thinking about optimization models, but with a caveat that actually with a little bit more complex, it's a little bit more of an area where we're thinking about what we want to do. But again, classic economics, classic statistical tools, very useful in that kind of environment because we can be data driven. Let's talk about wicked environments in the top right. If you're in a wicked environment and you're exploring, you really have no idea what's going on, and it's very limited in terms of what can those data points or what can those tools really give you, so that actually the stuff that's going to happen in the future really is related to what's happening in the past, and also we don't even know what it looks like anyway. So there's two ways we can approach this. One is if we're doing a completely new, completely wicked environment, we can think about, okay, how can we reduce that feedback loop time? How can we do more kind of, get quicker data? Either it's A/B testing to see, to try different things and see what works well, or we can think about, kind of very quick feedback in terms of, micro surveys, and just kind of trying to reduce that feedback loop so we understand what's happening. Maybe we could react quickly, because what we don't want to do is do a big experiment for 2 years and then realise actually we kind of knew it wasn't working within the first couple of months. The other one is really around how do we manage stakeholders in this process, because essentially the wicked environment is probably where you want to focus more or less on your data science skills and your analytical skills, but more on your consultancy and your customer facing skills, right? At the end of the day, what we want to be thinking about is how do we help leaders make decisions in ambiguous cases, right? Okay, so things like qualitative interviews, very useful to really understand what's going on, but also things like participatory analytics, right? Not predictive, we're not telling them what to do, but we're trying to involve them in the process, build tools that they can play with so they can find the answer themselves, but feel like they can actually use the data to map out and understand what they need to do and what are the trade-offs in that environment. Again, so having a very different approach involves a lot more stakeholder management, building relationships, building trust, and also thinking about the communication side. Less about doing something complex in the back, but also thinking about how do we, these are difficult things to explain, they're inherently ambiguous, they will require new metrics. How do we work with our stakeholders so they understand where we are, rather than going away for 6 months and coming back with something that they don't understand? So really thinking more of a consultative approach and thinking about the person, the individual, this behavioural economics approach, rather than doing something that's a bit more hardcore economics. The last area is probably a good area if you're familiar with strategic workforce planning, but it's when you have a wicked environment that's exploitative, right? So you have an exploitative environment where people feel, like we're trying to maximise things, we're trying to optimise things. It's an optimisation use case, for example, but actually the use case is completely bizarre. It's a call centre, but actually we're releasing a completely new product. We sold shoes, now we're selling pensions. I don't know. But essentially, it feels like it's something that we should be able to model out, but essentially there's too much change, the processes are completely different, and we have no idea what the future is going to hold. When we start doing this, we really think about our risk management or risk analytics point of view. Different scenarios, okay, what happens if the product does really well, what happens if the product does really badly, what happens if the technology that we're using to, kind of automate and kind of, deliver this new product doesn't work that well. Think about different scenarios and use those kind of, you can still use those data science tools and those models, but think about mapping out these different scenarios to kind of challenge people's assumptions and make them think about how do we mitigate these risks. But again, you probably don't need to go hardcore on building big models and so on, because the end point, we're not going to be able to predict the future. It's a wicked environment. The goal is to challenge and have conversations and build relationships and make sure that, again, stakeholders are making good decisions, or at least not bad decisions. So that's some of the technical stuff we can do. We zoom out a little bit. It's really kind of about behaviours and how we approach the problem, right? If you're in a kind environment, you can be data driven. You can be very accurate and detailed if you're doing those, exploitative call centre, staffing, very kind of detailed focus work. And if you're doing something that's more explorative, you probably will just want to have a little bit more humility around, okay, we don't actually know what the future's going to hold, but we can do some very fancy modelling, so we can make some very smart and nuanced challenges around actually how can we do things better, what might the future hold. And again, we can use really good tools and economic models and data science techniques to build some really great analytics products to help inform those data-driven decisions. In the wicked side, though, this is where I think we need to think about how do we approach problems different. Maybe like a consultant, maybe like someone from OD, right? If it's a wicked exploratory environment, like for example, if you're testing and doing something new, it needs to be fast and reactive, and we need to think about how do we change the data we're measuring so we have quick feedback loops so the customers or the stakeholders can make decisions quickly, change course as needed. The interesting one for me is when we go wicked and exploitative, right? You want to be very smart, you want to be data driven, but actually you can't be right. It's a wicked environment. You can't predict the future, therefore it's more important to be interesting and not wrong rather than it is to be kind of boringly right, which is kind of what you want to do if you're in a kind of exploitative environment, right? So it's about taking the stakeholder, making them think about things they haven't done, but you've got to be able to challenge them with data, with assumptions, with strong modelling skills or strong business acumen to make sure that you are building that kind of relationship, that trust, and then making them maybe think differently about the environment coming ahead, mitigating those risks, thinking about things that maybe they haven't done already, or potential future consequences of proposed actions. Now, hopefully that sounds very simple and basic. Let me make it less basic. We've got to remember that 2x2s are very nice on the page, but actually the whole thing's a mess, right? Some environments are changing massively, and we're sort of, something could start as a wicked thing, but actually as soon as we start to understand how we use it, what are the, kind of the drivers, the effects, what are the confounding variables, that's going to shift into a kind use case very quickly. At the same time, the whole world is changing, and actually what we were doing is going to be changing the principles behind it and so on. There's automation already happening, so actually moving as constantly updating what we're doing, constantly the business changing what we're doing, means that we're going to move from kind environments into wicked environments repeatedly. And I think this is where it's really important for HR, because the big question, who cares? HR should care. HR is already pretty wicked. It's about people, it's about decisions, it's about enabling productivity when we can't enable productivity because we can't measure productivity. So we're inherently in a pretty wicked world anyway within people analytics and HR itself. The problem is it's going to get more and more wickeder. I'm not sure if that's a word, but let's go with it, right? AI, automation is constantly happening. All those things that fall into that wicked box are either going to be automated at some point by machines, or we're going to complicate them and change them and make them wicked, right? So we've got to think about not just relying on working in kind environments. We've got to think about developing skills that enable us to have conversations or build tools or build analyses that's going to help solve wicked problems, be data informed but not necessarily data driven. And once we understand the different environments that we're in, we can think about, okay, what are the best tools to use? Should we use classical economics? Should we use behavioural economics? My thinking is actually the more we go forward, the more wicked the world gets, the more we need to rely on behavioural economic skills, both in how we measure, like participatory analytics versus predictive analytics, but also in terms of how we manage our stakeholders, how we hold those conversations, how we hold those qualitative interviews, and how we influence people without necessarily being able to let the data do the talking. So, how do we do that? That's what we're going to try and discuss next. I hope this has been useful, and I hope that this hasn't been a complete waste of your time. See you in the next one.